What's really tough is this dichotomy of waking up in the morning at the top of the world, of your world at least, and ending the day in one of the lowest, darkest points you can have, where in the morning, everything about the future is possible and you don't even think about the fact that life is finite. And by evening, your entire world collapses on you. And you understand in this very condensed time frame the fragility of life and how temporary it is.
Hi everyone, I'm your host Rohit Bhargava, and you are listening to episode 171 of the Startup Playbook podcast, a weekly series where I sit down with successful tech founders, investors, and operators to unpack their journey, lessons, and insights to help current and future entrepreneurs. The voice that you heard a little bit earlier was that of Micha Kaufman, the co-founder and CEO of Fiverr, and our guest for this episode. Many of you would know Fiverr as a successful publicly listed company that it is today, with hundreds of employees, tens of thousands of users worldwide, and a market cap of over $1 billion. But in this episode, Micha takes us behind the scenes of what it took for him to build a $1 billion business, specifically looking at some of how his early childhood and a health scare with his wife shaped how he views risk, the 3 companies that he founded before Fiverr, and the lessons and frameworks that he used to build Fiverr into the successful $1 billion company that it is today. But before we get into this episode, just a few quick notes from me. Firstly, this episode was recorded several months ago in early 2023, well before some of the events that took place over the last few months, which is why there's no mention of them in this episode. Secondly, I know that it's been a long time between podcast episodes. Juggling multiple businesses, life, and other priorities have gotten in the way, but the promise I'm making to you is that the podcast is now back on a weekly basis, and I'm excited to bring you more incredible guests with a ton of insight to help you on your own journey. And finally, this podcast wouldn't be possible without the incredible partners that we have on board. And so I'm delighted to be welcoming back Sender as a partner of this show. Sender is the OG startup accounting firm in Australia, helping you with all stages of your business. If you're a busy founder, chances are that you likely don't have time to manage your books or do your financial forecasts. And it's so helpful to have a team of experts in your corner helping you along the way. I trust them with all of my businesses and can't recommend them highly enough. You can find out more or get in touch directly with Gareth and the team at sender.com. And finally, I also wanted to welcome a new partner to the show, Vanta. For anyone who's followed me or the podcast for the last few years would know, I was involved with bringing a B2B SaaS accelerator program to Australia. One of the biggest challenges companies faced back then, as I'm seeing right now in companies that we're investing in Playbook Ventures, in our portfolio, that is selling to large enterprises, is how difficult, time-consuming, and expensive it can be to get ISO 27001 and SOC 2 compliance. These certifications are so important in building credibility and trust with large enterprise customers, but can be such a distraction and operational drain for an early stage startup. Thankfully, there's a tool to help you with this. Vanta helps you get and stay compliant by automating up to 90% of the work for the most in-demand compliance frameworks. And with over 300 integrations, you can easily monitor and secure the tools that your business relies on. There are over 6,000 fast-growing companies globally that use Vanta to manage their risk and prove their security in real time. To watch Vanta's 3-minute demo video or to speak to a local team member, head over to vanta.com/playbook. With that out of the way, and without further ado, here is my interview with Micha Kaufman. Hi Micha, welcome to the Startup Playbook podcast, and thanks so much for taking the time to be on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So Micha, those people that are listening that may not be as familiar with you or your background, do you want to share a little bit about your story and what got you here today?
So I'm the founder and CEO of Fiverr. Fiverr is a marketplace for digital services. It operates as an e-commerce platform where you can come in and buy digital services from experts from all around the world in about 600 different categories. The company started almost 13 years ago. It is my 4th company and definitely my biggest success so far. And it's actually my 2nd career, being an entrepreneur. I started my career as a practicing law, did that for quite a few years, didn't enjoy it, and we can talk about that if you want. That's about it.
Yeah, and obviously, I think a lot of the guests would be familiar with Fiverr or have used those services before. I certainly have in many companies that I've run as well, and can attest to the platform that you've built and the ease of bringing freelancers on. And obviously, as you mentioned, Fiverr isn't your first rodeo as well. You've been through the ringer a couple of times. But even prior to this, I think one of the fascinating things about interviewing founders like yourselves is just understanding where does a lot of this journey begin. And I've spoken a lot about on this podcast how for founders and entrepreneurs, I certainly have a lot of friends that aren't in the space who think that I'm a big risk taker. But for me, comparing it to what my parents went through in terms of moving from India without any contacts, without a job, with no money to try and search for a better life, this is no risk at all by comparison. And I know that you had a similar kind of story in when your parents decided to leave the kibbutz, which I think in your own words you mentioned seem like traders and you have to leave everything behind. But I think you mentioned before that it really helped give you that appetite for risk. But yeah, do you want to share a little bit about that story and what kind of grounding it gave you into your future career?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right to point out that my childhood story really informed how I thought about life and about risk taking. So my parents made Aliyah from Argentina to Israel back in '67. And when they came here, they came to a kibbutz, which was a socialist experiment of living together in a format where nobody owns anything and everybody works for the benefit of everyone. And so essentially, I was born in the kibbutz. And at some point, my parents decided to leave the kibbutz. And so when they did, they married very quickly in Argentina and came here. It was haste because they wanted to participate in protecting the country. And this was the War of '67 and then the one in '73. And so it was very important for them. So they did everything really fast. And they were broke. They didn't have anything. They didn't have a dime. And so they came to the kibbutz. And eventually when they decided to leave the kibbutz, and by the way, they left the kibbutz because at that time, the kibbutz had this arrangement where when you had a baby, that baby lived or at least slept during nights in a nursery home. That was a joint sleep arrangement. And so babies weren't sleeping with their parents. They were being kept by, it was just one or two of the moms were staying and looking over all the babies. And my parents had a hard time with that because they wanted to spend time with their kids. And so they decided to leave. And when they left at those years, if you left the kibbutz, you were considered to be a traitor. So essentially, you had the clothes that you had on you, and this was your farewell. So they found themselves broke again and just starting over without the safety net. And just so witnessing from the side this idea of self-made people that took massive risk in just coming to Israel and then leaving the kibbutz and then reinventing themselves every time without having a proper fallback position was very inspiring. And then seeing both the career trajectory of my dad in semiconductors and the type of super stable home that my mom has built for all of us as a safety net for my dad to take his own career risks, and for us as kids made a huge inspiration. And so for me, when I started thinking about my career, it was pretty obvious to me that I would take this entrepreneurial path at some point. What was unclear to me was what would be the starting point, because my dad was an engineer. He's an engineer. And for me, so I'm the oldest. And being the oldest, I have to go against the stream and not being an engineer. So I was looking for something that would be like a generally good education that would give me a broad spectrum and ticket into the business world. And that's why I decided to study law. And I specialized in IP, so that kept me very close to technology through patents. And so that was interesting. But it was just a matter of time until I made that jump. And actually, that jump was made because of a different story or different events that happened in my life.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if you're comfortable talking about this, but from having heard on other podcasts and speaking to a couple of people close to you as well, I understand a large part of that catalyst was challenges with your wife and her health at a particular time, which I think it's really fascinating that you had that experience where your parents had nothing and decided to take a big risk. And you obviously went through that experience, but then also going on the flip side where, from what I understand, you had a successful legal career under your belt, but obviously that sort of catalyst of everything that you and your wife and a young child at that time was experiencing helped push you. Again, if you don't mind sharing a big part of that journey, do you mind sharing what that process was like for you to eventually decide to move away from that legal pathway and onto the thing that you always knew you wanted to do?
Yeah. So the reality of things was that what happened with my legal career was a typical case of a golden cage, right? Where you start building a career on paper, you're very successful. You're making quite a lot of money. You work with some of the coolest brands and companies in the world as customers. You do very high exposure litigation cases and create a name for yourself. But I didn't like it. Actually, pretty much hated most of it. Intellectually, I think it was interesting, but the legal system is very tough in terms of the personas that usually engage with it. So working with other lawyers, customers, the legal system, the courts, that wasn't my favorite part of it. But you get drawn into it because as a young person, you make success, you get the headlines, you make nice money to your age. So that's a typical golden age. And for me, it was really a matter of when to make this jump. But as you continue your practice, it's just the years stop. And so when I was in my late 20s, I was probably 29, we had our first child. He was already about 3 years old, and life was good in general. We were building ourselves as a family. And then with the sheer luck and coincidence, we realized that my wife had cancer. And this was very tough. What's really tough is this dichotomy of waking up in the morning at the top of the world, of your world at least, and ending the day in one of the lowest, darkest points you can have, where in the morning, everything about the future is possible, and you don't even think about the fact that life is finite. And by evening, your entire world collapses on you. And you understand in this very condensed time frame the fragility of life and how temporary it is. So I'll give you the short version, but essentially she had a pretty small percentage of survival rate out of that. So this didn't look good. So I decided to leave work, and I actually I dedicated myself to creating this war room to figure out what to do, because she had a pretty unique type of cancer that wasn't very well known, and we had to figure out how to cope with it. So I remember going to one of the medical universities here in Israel. I was paying one of the senior students to actually teach me things and just show me the right books, because I didn't have time to do proper studies. And so I dedicated myself to this. And so this is how I spent about 6 months just taking care of home, my kid, her, in this not knowing if this is going to have a happy ending or not. But luckily she survived, and she went through it, and we went through it. And for me, that was a breaking point, because at that point I said, life is just too short to do things you're not passionate about. That sense of fragility and this idea that tomorrow, or at least the next year, 5 years, 10 years, are not obvious. They're not given. It's not a given fact that we have it. And so that triggered me to change mode and just have a much more of a sense of urgency. This idea of carpe diem, seize the day. Maybe when you hear sayings like leave every day is if it's your last, and it sounds either trivial or just naive, you get to understand what it means. And so that brought me this sense of urgency to not procrastinate on anything. Just whatever I had desired to do, I wanted to do now. I wanted to pursue that. So I couldn't go back to practicing. That was the end of it for me. And so I needed to phase out from the practice and deal with all of the clients that I had to move on. And at that point, I used that period to start working on my first startup. And this was a night project that became my full-time thing over time.
Yeah. And what did that process look like for you? I think, as you mentioned, when something like that happens, your kind of sense of normality changes. And as you said, gives you a very different sense of kind of urgency and drive. Was that a kind of instant decision where you said, I'm going to hand in my notice and go full time into this? Or did that look like more of a drawn out process while you worked out specifically what the next step was going to be for you?
No, I knew that this was the end of the first part of my career, but it was important for me to do two things. One is to figure out, what am I passionate about in tech or whatever field in which I would become an entrepreneur? What should be that? And this was pretty easy, because I was naturally drawn to certain things on the internet. And so that was easy for me. And the second is just to make sure that we gained a certain degree of stability at home that would allow for that level of risk taking and myself being sucked into this swirl of being a 24/7 entrepreneur. So this was a transitionary phase that took a few months alongside with my phase out from the practice. And I think it was a good thing because it allowed me to actually create a proper setup. In hindsight, when I think about the first company that I created, it was so naive. And you need to remember, we're talking about 20 years ago, 20 something years ago. And people that are online, younger generation today, it's like everything seems as if it's obvious and it's easy and everything is accessible. There was nothing online. If you wanted to become an entrepreneur, like basic questions, how do I start? How do I raise money? Nothing. Companies like Quora didn't exist, not to mention entrepreneurship books that are readily available right now. There was nothing. So I started super naively. The first company, but it was this leap of faith or the first step you need to make. And since then, when you think about it, it's just over the years. So I've created 3 companies before Fiverr. All of them were, and it's up to you, it's up to everyone to decide how they want to look at it. It's either different degrees of failure or different degrees of success. To me, it's just tuition. Every time you build a company, every time you make such a long list of mistakes. And I think what differentiates good entrepreneurs from those who, other than luck, is just the ability to learn something out of that experience and incorporate that in the next things you do and actually just decrease your error rate. Because we all err all the time. And it's just about decreasing that error rate over time and doing that cycle faster and faster, which builds you as an entrepreneur. But seriously, when I think about that first journey, it was almost laughable in hindsight. The way I approached it from a very lawyer standpoint, rushing to incorporate a company, file for patents, stuff like that, which I would never do today.
Yeah, and I think that's the experience for a lot of people that have been in the startup world for a long time. As you mentioned, it's a massive learning journey. And I've heard you describe Fiverr as a culmination of all of the lessons that you learned from your first 3 companies and trying to remedy those mistakes. Those 3 companies also happen to be in very different industries and fields as well. I'm just curious because I know that you reflected on the experiences that you had over all 3 companies, but what were some of the kind of similarities, or what were some of the things that after those first 3 that you said, these are definitely things that I need to either hone in on or focus on, the most important things in the next thing that I do?
I think what's actually interesting when I think about it is what I didn't have in any of these companies that I did have at Fiverr. So all these 3 first companies that I created were around areas that I was naturally drawn into, just out of curiosity, which I'm not saying it's not a good system to figure out what you want to work on, but it is definitely not the best system. And it is definitely not the most efficient system to figure out what you want to spend the next few years of your life doing. And I think that this was, each and every one of these companies was there to solve a challenge that I came across, either a challenge for myself or for someone else. So the first was a security software to encrypt and disguise files on hard drives and flash drives. This was something I thought about. I wanted to separate my personal files from my professional files on my computer. And again, this was 20 something years ago. This was a few years before flash drives actually appeared. So this was my problem, and I solved it. I went out and solved it and made a company out of it, which was an incredible story in and of itself. But from a corporate success standpoint, it didn't grow up to become a big company. It was generating very nice money for myself and my partner, and this was just fueling my other passions as well, but it didn't scale up. The second one was a company that really focused on creating IP in the field of vision correction, out of all things. And this was just, again, an idea that piqued my interest because I think my grandmother went through cataract surgery, and I was pretty fascinated about the process of doing so. I don't know if if you know what is done in cataract surgeries, but this is pretty mind-blowing, the things that are done inside the human eye. And so I started working on this idea of creating this photovoltaic advanced lens that would do discrete focal correction for people that underwent cataract, because you lose your ability to accommodate your vision when you go through this surgery. And then the third one was a content recommendation service. This was, you can think about it as an Apple News service 15 years ago, but so much more advanced. So it was basically the ability to understand people's interests and preferences in terms of content consumption and provide them with a personalized, tailored, dynamic newspaper or magazine for everything that they wanted. And this was, again, me. I was obsessively reading. I was subscribed to about 1,000 RSS feeds. And this was just, I spent my days reading. And probably 5% of it was interesting and the rest was just shit, right? But this was the time that I took to just find that 5% was just super high. And so that was the genesis of that idea. While these are all fine ideas, and they have their own merits, I don't think that I had the proper framework to think about ideas that could actually scale. And I probably didn't have the experience nor the talent at the time to actually build the right infrastructure to create these companies. So that was the commonality. I think the difference of starting Fiverr was this time I had a framework and I was armed by a long list of mistakes and things that I've done that I knew that I had to pay attention to. And I think that just made that journey so different.
Curious to dig into that a little bit further. I'm not sure if this is true or not, but I heard that you had a think tank prior to launching Fiverr to help you assess different ideas and those sorts of things. And as you mentioned, you finally had a framework in which to assess things that potentially you didn't have in the first three companies. Do you mind sharing what that think tank involved and also sharing what that framework was that you utilized to land on Fiverr?
Yeah, so as I was winding down my previous company, which was a process that I dwelled on for too long, to be honest. I think I had this sense of responsibility to my investors, my employees, to make the most out of it. So I was engaging in trying to sell the company for a long time, actually investing a lot of my own money in that process because we ran out of funding. And it was very important for me to do this. Sometimes when you close a company that you believed in, and this was a passion project for you, you go through these 5 stages of grief. And for me, the one thing that I've learned is that it's very important to do a retrospect on everything that worked and didn't work. Write it down, put it on a notebook, go through it, close that notebook and don't open it again. But just do that exercise of just being brutally honest with yourself about mostly the things that didn't work. And so I was going through that phase and I was just thinking about what's next. And this was an interesting period because this was around the recession of 2008. Actually started a little bit prior to that and then went through that phase of the recession. And I had a network of friends. Most of them were internet entrepreneurs at different stages of building companies or selling companies or figuring out what they wanted to do next. And I offered this idea of creating a think tank where we meet every week or two, bring booze and snacks and just spend an hour or an hour and a half just talking about things. And we were trying to figure out between ourselves what's next for software, what's next for internet. Because innovation comes in waves, and we were trying to figure out what would be the next wave to ride. So this seemed to be a good structure for thinking. And we said that if we come across an interesting idea, then we can decide to dedicate our time to it and collapse and just figure out how we want to work on it. So this was a framework that created a very high level discussions between myself and every participant in this think tank. So we had the meetings where we actually spent time together and brainstorm as a group. But then I also had one-on-ones with each one, and we were just thinking about what's next. So what was interesting is that process started making me think about creating a framework of how to think about ideas to work on. And at that point, I was in my late 30s and approaching my 4th company. It was very important for me to use all of the lessons I've learned so far to create a successful business that would make a positive impact on a lot of people. And so I was thinking about the framework, and I've looked at from a almost historical standpoint. I was looking at waves of companies company creation. And I came up with this concept that was pretty simple, but very useful. I love simple things because you can apply them pretty easily. So that framework said, instead of inventing a category, look for an existing market that is already very large, but could be potentially much, much larger, that had high degree of friction and inefficiency that you can potentially solve with software. And if you solve it with software, you can make that market even larger. Now, I know it's very simplistic, but if you think about it, you can apply this in hindsight to many companies that have done these types of disruptions in many fields. Amazon has done it to e-commerce. Commerce existed, it was large. E-commerce made it even larger. In commerce, had a lot of inefficiency and friction, right? In shopping, in fulfillment, and so forth. Uber has done that. Most people, young people, don't remember what it is to hail a taxi or talk to a dispatcher to call a taxi. I remember, San Francisco had 4 taxis. That was it. And then you would talk to a dispatcher and they would tell you, yeah, the taxi is going to arrive in 20 minutes. And you would stand out in the cold not knowing they're going to arrive. And then picking money out of your pocket to pay the driver. We don't think about that. Everything is just one click. But that's exactly that level of disruption. Airbnb has done it for hospitality. Like you can go on and on. And so that to me was a good framework, which allowed me, out of the many different ideas that we were bouncing, or that I was bouncing with my friends, when the idea for what later became Fiverr popped, it fell right into this framework, which created this aha moment. For me, this could be the idea.
And obviously, Fiverr is such a, again, in hindsight, such a genius sort of marketing and branding play just from the name alone. You get a sense of what it is that the platform does and all of those sort of things. But I imagine that 13 years ago, back in 2010, when you first started this and started pitching this around, there would have been a lot of pushback, both in terms of $5, what's the quality of this platform going to be like? And I imagine a lot of the fundraising conversations that you might have had at that time as well would have raised a lot of questions about how do you build a billion-dollar business off the back of collecting $5 from a platform. The scale that you would need to be crazy, and that just seems really difficult to do. What were some of the early stages of Fiverr like in terms of taking this concept out into the world and sharing it with people?
Yeah. So first of all, Fiverr started as a bootstrap company. So we didn't raise money. It was mostly our time and our personal investment and the time it took us to code it and design it and launch it. And the idea behind Fiverr was it was very important for me. One of the lessons learned from my previous companies led me to create this as a bootstrap business. And before getting into commitments with investors, I wanted to make sure that this had merit, this could work. And actually, probably the first 20 or 30 people I told this idea to told me it's either too crazy or too stupid to succeed, which just, when I think about it, just fueled me more. And it's very hard for people to imagine things they don't know and they can't see, right? There's the famous Ford saying, if all you know in your life is a carriage, it's very hard to imagine a car. And so I think that this was the reaction. And this, if anything, just gave me the sense that we will have a very quiet environment to develop this in, because it wasn't this obvious idea that everybody can copy in 2 seconds or just do faster. It had depth to it that people didn't realize. And so it was very important for me to create this as something that would grow grassroots, that would have a business model that would kick in from the first usage, and that would have the ingredients for scale, that would have this flywheel effect that would feed itself, and that the viral coefficiency of that is going to be very high. So it's going to be highly viral, very sticky. And all of that concept was built into it. And actually, the way Fiverr started from $5 services seemed almost like a gimmick. But this was the intention. The intention was to make it super viral and to pique people's imagination about. The first tagline of Fiverr was the things people do for $5. This was the tagline. And when you think about Fiverr, the public company with services ranging from tens of dollars to tens of thousands of dollars in hundreds of categories, it's almost funny, but you need to have a starting point. And it seemed to people that this was the purpose of this platform, but this was just the starting point. For us, this was just the beginning of the story. And this idea that would allow us to engage and build a community around this idea, a community of talent and community of businesses that need access to that talent, that would allow us to build a larger marketplace around it. So the beginning was, I didn't have to go through the humiliation of going to investors to have them tell me how stupid it is. And so when we raised the first seed money, it was just, the marketplace was just on fire at that point. It wasn't generating a ton of money, but it had a ton of traction. So it went extremely viral and it was growing very fast. And it was pretty easy to understand what was out there. It was tougher to understand what we were trying to build and how do we get there. And this, I give full credit to my first investors who invested in the company because they believed in that vision. But at that point, it wasn't crazy anymore. It was out there.
Yeah. One of the people that I spoke to as part of the research process for this interview was Ben Hensman, who is at SquarePay Capital, which led your Series D investment round. And he's kind enough to share some stats with me that when they invested in 2015, you were doing 100 mil GMV just within a couple of years. And as you mentioned, that kind of flywheel was really into effect at that point. Marketplaces are so hard to get up and running off the ground. And obviously you've done an incredible job in building what an incredible business Fiverr is now. But what did that early day one of Fiverr look like in terms of getting that initial traction? Because I assume from a platform where so much of it is reliant on having the right talent on that platform and all those sort of things. How do you approach the chicken and the egg problem of building that marketplace?
So I was new to marketplaces at the time. And again, a pretty naive approach to it. What I can tell you in hindsight, and I had this intuition, I was looking at other marketplaces and I was learning their stories. And what I realized was that with very few exceptions, when you build a two-sided marketplace, you always start from supply. If you're trying to build supply in a market that doesn't have demand, you're going to have a very tough time anyway. But I'll assume that people would do that level of research to figure that out. Don't obsess about demand at the beginning. It's not about that. So again, with the analogy, so Fiverr, it was about bringing freelancers. Airbnb was about bringing hosts. It was hosts first. Amazon was about inventory, right? Etsy, creators. So with very few exceptions that are super highly commoditized, you always start from supply. And this is where we focused at the beginning. So when we opened up, it's user generated basically. So it's an empty shell. You create, by the way, it should be noted that we were trying to do something that was never done before, which is we wanted to make the experience of buying a digital service from someone as easy as shopping online on Amazon or Etsy or Alibaba or whatever, which seems cool and like a simple idea, but it's super hard to pull off because unlike retail, the services space has no SKU system. So you may want to put it on a catalog, but no catalog exists in this area. Nothing is standardized. So we had to create this SKU system for ourselves. And so once you create that, you need to start to fill your shelves, right? Essentially. And so what we've done is I was selling stuff on the marketplace. We had to start somewhere. So we invited a few friends to just take a look and say, hey, maybe you want to play with it a little bit. And the way it was designed made it pretty irresistible for people to just offer something because it was so easy. It was so easy. It just asks you the question, what are you willing to do for $5? And so people wrote anything from very funny stuff to very serious things. And that fueled supply very quickly. And we did the hamster strategy. Like we went on forums, we asked people to look at it. And because of how interesting this idea was, how simple it was to just come in and look at the types of things that people offer and just click order and you are done, that piqued people's imagination so fast that we started having quite a lot of supply coming in. And that supply was also very vocal because they were starting to post, look at what I'm offering on Fiverr. And so people came in, and even if you didn't offer anything, you just came across this idea and it was so new and it was so borderline crazy that people had to talk about it. They told their friends. And so that created this initial wildfire. And then you learn about this flywheel effect where supply and demand feed each other. And if there's something we've learned over the years, and we've actually proven empirically, is that supply brings demand, period. And so those two things became engines that fed each other. And that was how this was created. And I think the virality was topped by just the fact that large media bodies, publications just picked up the story and fueled it even further. That made it like every cycle just was another step function. For the first few years, we haven't spent a single cent on marketing. It was just going so fast that we just concentrated on building the right product and the right level of service and the community that we wanted to build. So that was our focus. And then over the years, we've learned how to fuel that organic growth, which is still the majority of our business, by doing some smart marketing and just accelerating that level of growth.
Yeah, and speaking of cycles of growth and the Fiverr journey overall as well, it seems like a very basic and obvious question, but how does running a company like Fiverr at the very start change from what is now a publicly listed company? What are the things internally that stay the same, and what are things that change?
Pretty much everything changes, with maybe the exception of culture, because I think that the things, the fundamental things that actually over the years were, I started codifying them. I started defining what those principles were. But I think that spirit stayed. Other than that, everything changed. It started from my living room, and then we had like this small office in the countryside in Israel. And over the years, we start building a company, and that company becomes larger and larger. And you, as an entrepreneur, as a CEO, you lose the intimacy of knowing each person in the company in a deep way. You lose that, but you gain the power that you have by building an organization that continues replicating this DNA. So seeing this company scale so much over the years, but staying very true to the things that we feel are worth waking up in the morning to, is one of the best things that happened to me on Fiverr. Other than that, obviously it's very different. Taking the company public is not something that just happens, maybe to some companies. But for Fiverr, this was a build up over about 9 years. We were gearing up to take the company public about a year and a half or two before the actual IPO. So we were ready. So that transition was pretty smooth, I must admit. It wasn't very shocking in any aspect. Obviously, being a public company at the time and at the pace of acceleration that we had in the business was a roller coaster. And then the pandemic came. And all of these events were large events, but at the essence, the core of the business has been very true to its principles and operating in a very consistent way. And there's something, if I say it's not going to count, but people come to Fiverr, come to the office and say there's a certain atmosphere here. And I'm super happy that we didn't lose it. And actually, one of the things that I'm doing right now is you do this transition that is inevitable, and you don't beat yourself over it, because every company goes through it. But you move from this super early small startup to a more mature startup, to something that if you take a company public, it becomes a corporate very quickly, because you start having governance and compliance and stuff like that entering the organization. And what I'm doing now is I'm doing this reverse motion of making it the startup again, which is super fun. So you allow process to creep in, and it slows you down. And sometimes it happens without you noticing, and sometimes you do notice, and that's the price of maturation. And then it's the fun process of fighting it and saying, okay, great, but now we need to reinvent all of that and be a fast kicking startup again. So that's a process that I'm going through right now. And just the fact that we can do it as a mature company is a great thing. And the fact that we didn't lose the DNA that makes us what we are. And just seeing how you can move from these different phases within your organization. You can incubate new startups within your own company is just incredible.
Yeah, and that not losing the DNA, I think, is something that often gets spoken about, but I don't think it can be understated how difficult that is as well. Like, obviously, when you've got a team of 10 to 15 people and you can spend one-on-one time with everyone and know everyone intimately. That's a lot easier to do when you've got hundreds of employees. I'm sure Fiverr does at the moment as well. So from your perspective and for the benefit of founders that are listening, what are particular things that you do to prioritize that to ensure that core DNA that you exemplify, even things like trying to keep things simple, how do you pass that on beyond just the early employees into a broader team as you continue to scale?
So when you start a company, you were talking about 15 or 20 people. When you're a very small company, the DNA is you. It's you and probably the first few people that you hire. But then those people, some of them are going to stick around, some of them are going to move on. I think the important thing to do is when you build a company, so codifying the things, the principles that you care about. It's not just enough to want to have a culture and to have a DNA. You need to put substance into it. You need to try and define what are the things that we stand for, what are the things that we care about, what are the things that characterize who we are and the people that we want to be. So when you do that, it's very important not to compromise on yourself and people around you if they don't align with those principles. So it's about choosing the right people to join you because they're going to be the RNA. They're going to multiply the DNA over and over again. You're not, as a founder, as an entrepreneur, you're not going to be able to do that. Your influence over that diminishes as the company grows. And then as a leader over time, I think what's most important is to speak about the principles, about the DNA over and over again. And not just speak to make it there, but just also act by those principles to give a personal example, right? So it's important when we were doing the right things because they fall within the principles and the things that we care about, and people can actually see that. So I think that those are the most important things. And it's just about caring about the culture because maybe it's obvious, maybe it's not, but not all entrepreneurs care about culture. They may speak about culture because it's the right thing to do. Everybody speaks about culture, but they don't genuinely care about it. And I think that wanting to have a culture and just obsessing about this is probably the most important thing. And then it's just, what do you want to define that culture by? And then don't compromise on the people that you hire if they don't fall within that culture. And I'm not talking about hiring the same people. I'm all for hiring the most diverse types of people. But you need to be able to agree on certain principles. And if you can't, that's very hard to create a culture of when there's high level of disagreement on the basic stuff.
Micha, there's easily another hour's worth of content and notes that I've got that I'd love to talk to you about, but just mindful of time, maybe I'll finish off with one last question. Given the current context and climate that operating in as businesses where there's a ton of layoffs and a lot of startups and founders are finding it really tough to raise capital and have a lot more uncertainty compared to what it was like a couple of years ago. I'm just going to pull up a quote that I heard you mention from your dad, which was, take the time to remember the positive moments in your life because you're going to have to go back and draw from these moments in darker times. Do you have any advice for founders that are listening to this podcast in terms of how to navigate the next few months, years of potentially challenging times ahead for their business?
So the first thing I will say is that it's a cycle. It is going to pass. And that's very important to say because when I've been in business in 2000, I've been in business in 2008. So I've been through recessions and cycles. And a lot of the younger generation, if you're in your early 30s, you've never seen markets go down. For you, that's the first time in your life. It's not unusual. Don't freak out. It's a cycle. It is going to pass. I don't know exactly when. It could take a quarter. It could take a few, but it is going to pass. So that's the first thing. So give yourself perspective because it's not going to be like that forever. The second thing is it's not your fault. These are forces that are greater than all of us. No one in the world, including the Googles, Amazons, Microsofts of the world, cannot win against macro. And so that forces companies to make cutbacks and layoffs, and it's not anyone's fault. When you think about this period, I think this is, when I went through these cycles, I always saw these as opportunities. And maybe this is because I'm optimistic and as you have to be as an entrepreneur. But just looking at the upside of it, I think most people that were laid off from high tech were very well paid, so they have a little bit of security cushion. It's a good time to learn something new. It's a good time to start a new business. Yes, it's harder to raise money today, but if you start a business today, you're gonna have to raise money in 6 months, 9 months. It might be much better if you look at cycles before. Same applies to 2000 or 2008. At the wake of the recession, at the other half of the recession, there's a rebound. At the rebound, there is probably the highest level of new business creation. If you think about Fiverr started after the recession of 2008, Airbnb, Uber, Lyft, all of these companies started at the end of a recession. It's a good period of reinvigoration, of new growth. So using that as an opportunity to learn something new or starting something new, I think is good. And I think it's also good to understand, to have perspective, because again, this cycle is going to pass. And I think that just having one view that the world always becomes better and everything becomes larger and nothing goes down and no markets have instability and everybody becomes richer, and it's just a wrong perspective over history. If you zoom out, that this never happened. It was a very long positive cycle, but it always ends with these types of events. So this is probably my best advice, is just use that time to become better at what you're doing, or explore new things, or just starting something new, and don't beat yourself up on it because it's not your fault. And that's really important. And go pursue your dreams. It's a good opportunity for some people to have a wake up call and say, hey, was I doing something I was passionate about? Or was it just a job? If it's the latter, maybe you should do a career change, or maybe you should change your path.
Fantastic advice. And on that note, Micha, thank you so much once again for coming on the podcast and for sharing your experience and insights. For anyone that wants to find out more about you or Fiverr, what's the best way for them to do that?
Fiverr is pretty self-explanatory, so just go on fiverr.com. If you want to learn more about me, I don't know, there's probably too much online anyway. Follow me on Twitter, DM me. If you want to have a chat, just reach out. Happy to talk. And thanks for having me, Rohit.
Of course. I'll make sure all of those links are in the show notes. Micha, once again, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to episode 171 of the Startup Playbook podcast. As always, full show notes from this interview will be available at startupplaybook.co. I'll be back next week with another episode, but in the meantime, if you enjoyed this interview, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. As always, thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next week.